some reasons for why founders would go out and raise money and try to get outside capital. There's more than three, but I've got three that I see a lot. One is speed, and so a lot of businesses, especially tech-based companies, don't have the luxury necessarily to wait for their revenue to exceed their expenses and be able to grow organically. So a lot of times there's a speed to market issue that needs to be dealt with by bringing in outside capital. Another reason is validation. If you're a founder and you can get a professional investor to put money into your company, that's going to give a certain impression to other investors and other people in the market that maybe what you're doing, and that's not necessarily always a good thing, but it is reality. And sometimes these companies, you may need validation in addition to whatever potential customer validation or market validation you're getting. Bringing in an investor who has done this before and sees something valuable in your business can give you some validation as well. And then third, probably not the most exciting or desirable reason, would be survival. Especially in times like we're dealing with right now. It's not uncommon to see companies that are kind of running out of the capital that they need to get to the next spot. And you don't really want to end up in that position because you don't have a lot of leverage. But at the same time, if you're basically handed a decision of, shut it down now or take the deal that's available, most people will continue to fight and kind of move forward and try to do it that way. So survival is another reason. Moving on to the next slide here is basically strategy and figuring out, okay, now why you're doing this, but let's make sure that actually lines up with what investors would be looking for, and really that your interest as a founder will line up with what the investor wants is very, very important. So it's always important to consider, what are you really trying to build? Are you building a company that you intend to grow to a certain level and then exit within 5 to 8 years or so? Or are you really trying to build something that's going to be longer lasting than that? Most venture investor type people are going to be looking for an exit in that 5 to 8, 9 year time frame. So if that doesn't really line up with what you want, you might be barking up the wrong tree, and you don't want to do that. Next is, do you really need the outside capital to get there? Not to disparage any of our investor clients at all. A lot of businesses that are super successful and valuable to the economy and our communities wouldn't happen without investors. So it's super important to have them. But if I was a founder of a tech startup, I would do everything I can to try not to bring in that additional money unless it's really, really necessary. And if it is necessary, you want to make sure that you're bringing in the right people that have value beyond the dollars that are going to help you in multiple ways. And so figuring out if you really actually need the capital to get to whatever your end game is very, very important at the beginning before you start, really getting involved with investors or anyone else. And we could talk about that more, but I mean, investors really become your partners, and so you need to make sure that your interests are aligned and they're the right people for you, and you're the right business for them. And then if you sort of decide, yes, we do need investment money, we know what we're trying to do, it lines up with what investors want. It's very important to understand how much money you need in order to get to the next, the next inflection point is what I have on the slide. But basically, that next spot in your journey where you're going to raise more money, you got to sort of backfill for how much cash you're going to need to get there. You don't want to do too little, because that will end up putting you in that, if we go back a slide and look at the reasons for why, it's going to put you in sort of a desperate position where you're raising money to survive, which you don't really want to do. If you raise too much money, then you're selling the company at a lower value, and you're really kind of, shooting yourself in the foot. And so you want to get a pretty good idea of how much money you want to raise in each round to get you to your next milestone, next stopping point. Some places or sources of funds, and their potential motivations. People have all different kinds of reasons for doing what they do. Like I mentioned, but a lot of companies, a lot of founders raise their first round of financing from friends and family. There are options for crowdfunding that are still relatively new, are not necessarily they just weren't available. Those options for crowdfunding weren't necessarily available 5 years ago or so. Then you have angel investors, which historically at least tend to be kind of earlier stage, maybe smaller investment amounts, versus venture capital funds, which are, you sort of think of them as, writing bigger checks or maybe later stage investors. But the line between angel investors and venture capital, investors is not, it's not super crisp anymore. Angel investors can be individual people. There are angel funds, there are angel groups, but typically they do tend to be earlier stage investors, where your venture capitalists will put money into early stages depending on what their goal is, but would also be there at least for the later stages. Banks are always a possibility, although for early stage companies, they're not much of a possibility. Banks are not normally willing to take that much risk in providing loans. The government, there are a lot of federal and state and also private grant programs, especially if your company does anything with R&D. There are tons of grants out there, which is a great option, especially at the earliest stages. And then savings, which a lot of people get to the point where they want to save their company and they end up using 401k money and putting another mortgage on their house. And it's really important to think through, the repercussions of doing that. There are stories, there are success stories and horror stories alike on both sides of that line there. So, but that is, another possibility of a financing source.